Thank you all for joining us today or tonight, wherever time zone you're in. And today we'll take a very close look at the building at the center of everything at Vindolanda, or at least at the center of Stone Fort 2, the Principia, the headquarters building. And I'll share a bit more about Vindolanda's archives and show you, I hope, just how much there is to learn from revisiting historic data. Tonight's talk is part of this winter's Archive Archaeology project, highlighting the archival research that we've been doing here. In this off-season, I've been digging through Vindolanda's archive because the Vindolanda Trust holds an incredible collection of archival materials, from the archaeological archive, all of the paperwork that's generated as we're excavating, to the legacies of individuals like Eric Burley and Charlie Anderson, who was a mason for the Ministry of Works who oversaw and photographed the consolidation of much of Hadrian's Wall, as well as archives of the history of the Trust itself. And much like a recent Vindolanda project, creating connections, digging deeper into Vindolanda's collection, which has been looking at the object database, there's a huge amount of work to be done on Vindolanda's archive to protect it, to catalog it, to digitize it, and to make it widely accessible. So if listening tonight makes you more interested in learning about what we've been up to in the archives, I will direct you to our blogs on archive archaeology off of Vindolanda's webpage under the blog link. So why should the archives be the headquarters for research? And really, what more is there to learn about the headquarters building here at Vindolanda? It's something that has been dug and known and understood for almost 100 years. So what really is there to learn? Tonight, we're going to look at two things. We're going to look at the phasing and the construction of the Principia building, which was part of the work that I did in my PhD. I never intended to be an archivist or to focus on legacy data, but the material is absolutely incredible. And there was so much opportunity to learn more and to look again at this building. And then the second part of what we'll do tonight is we'll link the archive and the archaeology. And this is an opportunity to demonstrate just how much exciting archaeological research is possible in the archive, and especially what can happen when we start to link what's in the archive with what is happening in the modern archaeology out on site. And above all, it's what we'll talk about is why it's so important to bring these two things together, the archives and the archaeology, the opportunity for new discoveries, but also just as the archaeology underground is fragile and needs to be protected, and that's part of the research that the Vindolanda Trust has been doing with climate change, so too does our legacy data need to be protected. And now is the moment for us to be undertaking this research. So tonight we'll start with a brief context about the site for those of you who are less familiar with Vindolanda, or perhaps have forgotten which cohorts came from where and when. And then we'll take a look at the sources of evidence, yes, the archive, for the Principia building in particular, and dig into what we can learn from all of them together. So where are we? Vindolanda, of course, is located on the northern frontier of the Roman Empire. It's along the Steingate Road, which is the modern term for the first road that demarcated the frontier, about a mile south of Hadrian's Wall. So not on the wall, but looking up at it, which is really the better way to have the view. And when exactly are we talking about? Vindolanda has quite a long period of occupation, and there will not be a quiz on the list of who came and left when. This is 800 years of history, and there are many different phases, each with distinct garrisons and, importantly for what I'm after, distinct architectural features. But to simplify things, we will be looking at the later period at Vindolanda, the 3rd century, from Stone Fort 2 and beyond into the late and the post-Roman period. And you'll notice here that we have fewer distinct phases, but we're covering a much longer period of time. This is one of the challenges of the archaeology, is that we're not able to be quite so specific, in large part because we're closer to the surface. There's been more damage, more erosion. But what we can still do, even if we can't pinpoint in a year-to-year change, is think about how the site developed and transformed over this extended period of time. So we know we're at Vindolanda, we know we're looking in the Stone Fort 2 period, but where exactly is Stone Fort 2? And fortunately, for those of you who visited the site, what we're talking about is what you would see on site today. Much of the structures that are consolidated, and this plan shows which structures are visible when you're walking on site today, those structures are in fact from Stone Fort 2. And this is, fortunately for us, fortunately for me, I think some of the other archaeologists would disagree, a challenge of preservation requirements that when we excavate, we need to conserve the walls that come across. And if we wish to continue working to a deeper part of the site, those earlier walls do need to be maintained. So it's less helpful for the earlier periods, but great for when we're talking about these sort of mid to late Roman period and into the post-Roman period. Within Stone Fort 2, we're talking specifically about the Principia building, the headquarters at the heart of the fort. Starting from approximately 213 AD, so the early 3rd century. And this is, yeah, it's the headquarters. It's right at the middle. It's right at the center of everything. But Stone Fort 2, for all that it looks fixed like that, was not set in stone. And for all that it looks fixed when we see it on site today, it's actually a series of structures that change quite dramatically over the centuries. But if you look closely at the Principia building at the center of these drawings, it's not really changing. And partly that's a flaw in the drawings. I need to make some updated plans, but partly that also reflects the previous interpretations. And without having changes to the structure that reflect how it was changed, how the building actually was modified over time in these plans, we tend to forget that the building did develop as we go from the 3rd through the 4th and into the 5th century and beyond. These buildings are not fixed. They do grow and change as the needs of the people who are living in them grow and change. And that's exactly what we'll be able to look at from the archives tonight. So for those who are not Roman frontier archaeologists all of the time, what is the Principia in principle? It is the administrative heart of the fort. It is the center of everything. And who exactly is in there? It's our commanding officers, it's our administrators, it's our regular soldiers when they need something, but probably not all of the time. And what exactly is stored inside? Things of value, the legionary standards, pay, paperwork, valuable to those of us who do archives things. And so if we're going to have all of these things in the Principia, we need a building that reflects those asks, right? The design is going to follow what the goals for the structure are. So what are some of the key architectural features? First of all, its location at the center of the fort, right? This is the administrative heart. It is at the crossroads from the 2 main gates, and it is in the middle of everything and everybody's business. Then, as we look inside the structure itself, it's a building with depth. It's built on a long axis. In the case of the Vindolanda Principia, a north-south axis. And as you move through the building, you move through areas of increasing importance and increasing areas of security, right? This is a similar idea if you've been to Pompeii, if you've seen Roman houses, that you move from increasing public space to private space, from the street to the rear of the structure. So in the case of the Principia, we move from an outside accessible space through a courtyard space where certainly large groups of people could gather, and then we move into the cross hall, this main central room where maybe your soldiers would muster to hear orders, to get paid. And then finally, at the top of the plan on the right-hand side are the 5 administrative rooms that comprise the bulk of the function in the Principia structure. They're administrative spaces, but they're also safety and storage spaces at the far end. And in the center is a room that has a pit excavated out underneath it. The thought is that that's where the standards would have been kept. And that's also in the pit beneath the floor where it would have been secure, where the soldiers' pay would have been kept. So the Principia is, in principle, an administrative center, but also fundamentally a multi-use space. And it's something that can do a wide variety of things. And the architecture does need to reflect that. But this is the Principia in principle. It's just how we as modern scholars conceive of the ideal design for this structure. And this is a conclusion informed by excavations across the Roman Empire. But nonetheless, this is a Principia for what we think of as the best version of itself of the Roman army at the height of its power. And that's great. But as we know, it doesn't stay at the height of its power. there comes a long decline. Well, if it's a decline is also debatable, but there comes a long period of change in the later Roman Empire in which the needs of the army's organization and administration will shift and change. And we'll see that in the building. And that's the Principia in practice, how it was used, how it was lived in, and how it was transformed over centuries. And that we can only understand from archaeology. Good thing we're here at Vindolanda and we have lots of archaeology. But that archaeology is something that happened nearly 100 years ago as part of Eric Burley's first excavations here. And so we have a few problems. The first and perhaps the most pressing of which is documentation. And if we don't have the records, we can't really look again at archaeology. Archaeology is something that happens only once, right? It is a finite science. For it to be replicable, either we have to save a piece of the area that's been excavated to re-excavate at a later date when we have better techniques and better technology, or we have to take really, really good notes so that we can look again at those notes and say, huh, I see they've said this happened. I look at this and see something different. So if we want to look at the Principia in practice, if we want to look again at those interpretations, we need to dig into the archaeological record, the history, the publications, and the precious material that tells us what exactly happened that's not included inside the publications, of which actually, fortunately, there is quite a lot, including, as you can see on the lower right, Bunty, who was Eric Burley's dog and was certainly an archaeological assistant on site, as dogs are often known for their hole digging skills. If we want to think about the excavations at Vindolanda, we need to contextualize the site's modern excavation history. An awful lot has happened here since 1929 and the start of the sort of modern era of archaeology. Perhaps the most important was the foundation of the Vindolanda Trust in 1970, which has made the extensive work that you can see on the right possible, both inside and outside the fort walls. But before the foundation of the trust, the period we're looking at, the 1930s, is when Vindolanda really was just a field. The fort field, but a field nonetheless. And in 1929, Eric Burley purchased Chesterholm and its fort field on the advice of Thomas Heppel, who was the foreman and the excavator for the Clayton estate. The Clayton estate encompassed a large area of Hadrian's Wall and many of the key archaeological sites, including Housesteads, but unfortunately, Eric Burley didn't have quite enough spare change to take both Vindolanda and Housesteads in 1929. But fortunately for us, he did choose to purchase Chesterholm because he was advised that the archaeology was more interesting here. And he lived in what is now the museum. He began to teach at Armstrong College of Durham University and ran a campaign of excavations along the wall, including in his own backyard. And the excavations at Vindolanda that he was running took place from 1930 to 1935, with a wide cast of characters, including his wife, Margaret Burley, who was a pottery specialist, Sir Ian Richmond, who went on to teach at Oxford, and to write and run many other excavations along the wall, and of course, Thomas Heppel. And the beauty of the archives is that we get to know the people. The photograph in the center shows us a great view of the south range of the Principia building with its hypocaust. But what's also important to note is that it's a portrait of the author, and there's a note on the back in Eric Burley's handwriting saying that this is his portrait of himself. And the excavations that happened from 1930 to 1935 covered the key and most important, and to Eric Burley, the most interesting features of Vindolanda. The Principia itself at the center of the fort, some sections of the walls, and some of the gates. Because if you want to know about the Roman army, the Principia, the walls, and the gates really are the place to begin. And how do we know this? From a few publications. There were a few publications that were primarily in Archaeologia Aeliana, the journal of the Society of Antiquaries of Newcastle upon Tyne, but there really weren't as many as we might have hoped, because World War II, of course, interrupted the publication process. And unfortunately, the publications don't tell us quite so much about the details. They give us a sweeping coverage of where they worked, some drawings of what they found, some of the pottery, some of the coins, and most importantly, they give us the weather report. Every good interim field report from this period begins with a discussion of how much it rained that particular season. But the things that are missing from these publications are some of the essentials when we start to think about archaeological research. What specifically was excavated when? Which parts happened in which years? What was the sequence? How were the parts of a building labeled? We have coins from these excavations with notes saying they came from room A, B, or C in the headquarters building, but without a plan to tell us where these rooms are, we don't know. So that makes it difficult if all we have to work with is publications. But fortunately, we have the archives, and from the archives, we can learn a whole lot more. They are not, I should caution, the magic bullet. Archives are only as good as what has been preserved. Sometimes you get exactly the page or exactly the photograph you need, and sometimes you hunt to the ends of the library only to discover that, in fact, those notebooks, those photographs, those papers are gone. And those heartbreaking moments are incredibly frustrating, but they're more than made up for the absolute needle in the haystack of discovering something completely unexpected. And archives do need creativity. You have to be willing to look at a wide variety of sources because these sources and their preservation are so limited. And you never know what from one to the next is going to link together and teach you something new about the site or about the person. Even if it doesn't shed light in that particular moment when you find it, you might come back and discover that it is showing, this piece is the linchpin and is the connection. So what are the types of materials we're looking at? We're looking at notes and notebooks. Of course, that's the thing that you hope for. Sometimes they tell you what you need to know. Sometimes they're not quite so helpful. This note from this set of notes on the left is Eric's notes from the 26th to the 28th of May, 1932. We have a lovely section drawing for the 27th, but on the 26th, we have an important note, very little work done owing to rain. Yes, this sounds familiar in Northumberland. Sometimes we'll get lucky, especially for these early excavations, and get photographs. Of course, it's not a world where you can simply take pictures with your phone. Each photograph is much more precious. And these photographs are also essential for seeing the details firsthand, right? We have texts that describe what they found, but texts are always an interpretation on the part of the writer, and the photographs are what allow us to look again. And remember this image here in the center, this negative, because it's going to become very important. Something else that's surprisingly useful is correspondence. You know, a letter between friends, archaeological colleagues saying, oh, this is what I'm up to, these are the papers I'm writing, I'm going to a conference. Oh, but by the way, I've found this, can you advise? It's that last bit that will sometimes have the missing detail that's been mentioned offhand. And these archives, many of them can be somewhere convenient, but often they're distributed across a wide range of places. And in the case of Vindolanda's archives, just for looking at Eric Burley's materials, I've been working across 5 institutions in 2 countries. So the material is here at the Vindolanda Trust in the Eric Burley archive, but it's also in the Bodleian Art and Architecture, Classical Art and Architecture Library. Sorry, they've just renamed it and I have not quite kept track. It's also in the National Archive in London. There's material in Edinburgh. There's material in English Heritage and Historic England down in Swindon. And there's also material at the Römisch-Germanisch Commission in Frankfurt and at the University of Freiburg in Germany. So this goes to show you that the reach of this material is wide. And you just have to keep looking. That's really what's important. Because if you do keep looking, you start to find answers to your questions or to questions you didn't know you have. And so some of the things I was looking to find in the archives was the excavation process. Exactly what work was conducted when, and then this allows us to help put together the picture of the structure, not just the parts that they were interested in describing in the publication, but also the parts that we might be more interested in now. So how did that building look in excavation, and what were the changing interpretations for the structure? And the key thing here is to be able to put together as many different pieces as possible. Photographs, notebooks, and sketches along with the published interpretation. So what we've got in this set is an excellent example of the comparison between the Secellum, this room for the Chapel of the Standards, at the south end of the Principia. We can see it in a photograph from the 15th of July, 1932. We can see a very good sketch from Thomas Heppel's notebook from May 1932, and Thomas Heppel really was the better excavator. And then we also have a page from Eric Burley's notebook, again from May 1932, drawing both a detail of the central Secellum room, describing the coins that were found. And then we also have a drawing that shows how he's labeled the different sections and subsections of the room. And these sketches are particularly interesting because as you go through his notebooks from May 1932 to June 1932, and then into the few notes that we have from 1933, we can see that the labeling for the rooms changes. But what we also have are lists of coins, and then what we can begin to do is match the coins that have the coins from a specific date with the drawings from a specific date and put together what came exactly from where. And that's really exciting because this is something that we didn't have until these papers came out of the archive. And so these archives let us put new pieces together for smaller materials like the finds, but they also let us look again at the things that perhaps should seem fixed. Part of the challenge is that we perhaps can't quite trust our own eyes on site today. The process of consolidation, work being done now, of course, I'm not talking of what's been happening now, but consolidation that was happening in the 30s and 40s and 50s, the goal was something that was aesthetically pleasing, something that conveyed the spirit of the place, but perhaps didn't capture exactly what it looked like when it was excavated. And it's really important for us to know what this building looked like when it came out of the ground, because otherwise, how can we study it? Well, if we're not studying the building as it was excavated, then we're studying somebody else's interpretation of the structure. And so what we can do in the archives is begin to compare the building as it was excavated, as we can see in the photograph from 1933 of the tribunal platform on the west side of the Principia. And it's got a nice first two courses, and then it gets a little bit less organized. We've got a big stone on the upper right. But when you come to look at how the building was consolidated from 1954 and from today, that's not the structure that we're seeing on site. And so as much as we can do architectural and structural analysis, physically standing, looking at the remains, we also really need to check our work with the material in the archives. And so this is where the value of the archives comes in, is it lets us look again and look more closely at the material. And so what happens then if we really want to look closely at the Principia? If we dig into it, so to speak. So Eric Burley published the phasing for the structure in his AA article in 1936, but it's not entirely satisfying, either in terms of chronological framework, which could be discussed later, or in terms of the structural assessment, which is what I'll focus on now. So with the archive, we can look closely at the building, particularly the ways in which the building was changed over time after it was initially constructed, to better understand how it was used over several centuries, from its initial construction in 213 onward into the late and the post-Roman period. And then we can use that to understand how this Principia building fit into the larger social and spatial landscape. So what are we working with if we're working with this building and these archives? It was excavated between 1932 and 1935. We're looking at the work of Eric Burley, really perhaps better to say overseen by Eric Burley, and the excavation work by Thomas Heppel, and with Ian Richmond's support in the final years of the excavations. Burley and Richmond published their work in Archaeologia Aeliana in 1936, and they interpreted the building as having two phases, Constantinian and Theodosian, which was in line with the Hadrian's Wall period chronology of the time. That's now changed. But other than that, not very much has shifted in the last 90 years. The dates have changed. Constantinian is now thought to align with the Stone Fort II period, so early 3rd century. Theodosian with the later 4th century. And then, of course, there's been excellent work in the latest post-Roman report from the Vindolanda Trust, which identifies the features that remained in use, but the Principia wasn't the focus of the work in this period. But in their report, Burley and Richmond emphasized that the plan was not standard, and that was perhaps the first key that we needed to look again at the structure. They called attention to the walls inside the courtyard and to the veranda on the street, and we're saying these are really not normal when you start to look at other Principia buildings, either along Hadrian's Wall or more broadly across the empire. And I would say that these non-standard elements are in fact non-standard because they're later pieces of construction. And that's a conclusion that I think we can come to from both structural and from archival analysis. So if we want to think about the Principia differently, I would propose that it was built at the beginning of that one that was built at the beginning of Stone Fort II period was simpler. It had an open courtyard and the facade aligned with the buildings on either side of the main road and aligned with the main drain, rather than having this sort of veranda structure that pushes into the Via Principalis, which is the key east-west route through the fort. So that significantly simplifies the structure. I think, at least for now, I would propose that the southern end stays the same, a cross hall with 5 chambers, the middle again interpreted as the Sacellum or the Chapel of the Standards, with a sunken area beneath the floor. But if I want to take some walls away, what's the evidence for removing them? Perhaps rather than thinking about taking walls away, we should think about reassigning them. I think that these walls that were so problematic to both Eric Burley and Ian Richmond, in fact, they're part of a middle phase of construction in the early 4th century. And in the early 4th century, if you think back to this long list of who came and went when, we have a gap in Vindolanda's occupation in the last quarter of the 3rd century. And then we have business resuming, as usual, in the early 4th century with another iteration of the 4th cohort of Gauls, who are the ones who built Stone Fort II to begin with after 213. And much of the fort buildings were rebuilt in this early 4th century period. But life in the fort has changed considerably as we come into the late Roman Empire. The extramural settlement has been abandoned. The entire community is living within the fort walls. We need more usable space. We need more space to store things. We need more space to contain things. The Principia does remain at the center, but it's likely that it and all of its surroundings were rebuilt. So what could have been added in the early 4th century? The veranda walls that would have expanded the space of the structure, pushed it into the main road, providing shelter space, providing more courtyard area, especially if we add walls into the courtyard space and enclose some of it. Then as we lose interior space, we're gaining it back on the street itself. Another thing that I think was likely added is a drain that's running from the courtyard out the western door and into the road that is between the Principia itself and the granaries that are just to the west. And if we want to add these things, then we need to take a look at the architectural details. So, architectural arguments for adding the veranda are that the stones are quite different. The material is quite different from the rest of the structure. And the scale of these large stones, which you can see in the foreground in this picture, and that's Thomas Heppel on the left. It's nice to put a face to the name. And these veranda stones are significantly larger, and those align with and match the stones that are found in the extramural settlement, which at this point was abandoned. That makes it a perfect quarry for building material. So that's an argument for the addition of the veranda. Different construction style, different material that can be sourced from nearby structures at this point in time that are out of use. Then, if you remember that negative that came out of the Vindolanda archives, let's have a look at the courtyard walls and the interior rooms. One of the key ways of identifying how and when a wall was built, if it's masonry, is its relationships to other walls in the corners. The interior walls in the courtyard abut rather than coin, so they meet and hit against rather than lock into the corners, suggesting, well, really indicating that they were built that those interior walls were built at a later date against a standing structure. But if you remember me making quite a big deal about the issues with consolidation, that's not something that we can rely on seeing on site today. That's something where we need this archival evidence. We need this negative that you can enhance and lighten to be able to take a look into that far, far corner in the back and say, yes, that is how it was, not only how it was built, but also how it can be seen when we look at the consolidation today. And then lastly, the drain. And who would have thought you could be so excited about drains? But this drain is really quite cool. So it's a drain that we can see that's built through this added wall. First indicated that the drain is of a later date, but there's more feature or more details in the drain that let us know that it is also an early 4th century addition. The drain has an inscription in it, which is great because inscriptions are really very helpful for dating. So Eric Burley's excavation found a broken inscription stone, now known as RIB 1705, which was used in the construction of the drain. The inscription's been interpreted as a dedication to Caracalla, dating quite tightly from 213. And it has actually, well, when it was found, it had traces of red paint in the first lines. And this is something that's really important because that helps to indicate that it was not simply an inscription that broke as it was being written and was immediately reused, suggesting then that it was from the period at which it was inscribed, but instead that as it had been painted, it had been displayed, it was used. And then in a later period, it's taken down, it's broken, and then it is reused in a later construction. But how can that alone give us a date to the later construction? We can do that when we connect the historic excavations with the modern excavations. So we have 2 more pieces of this same inscription that were found 75 years later as part of the granary excavation campaign. And one piece of the inscription was found in the granary itself, in the channel fill, which is very closely stratified and comparatively easy to date because it's in sealed layers. And so we can see that one of the pieces is coming from an early 4th century context, and that piece is coming from what aligns exactly with the doorway across from where the drain comes out. The other piece comes from across the street, across the Via Principalis, in the rubble fill of what's known as the Riacus building. That doesn't date quite as tightly as the granary fill allows us to, but it was part of a larger renovation and construction work that was taking place across the site. And it's this modern archaeological evidence that lets us date the drain. And in linking the construction of the drain, we can connect that to the construction of the interior walls. And then we can start to see and fix a date for the larger program of architectural change within the Principia. And that's something that fits into the context of the broader developments and the broader construction and changes that are happening at Vindolanda in the early 4th century. And this is something that is really what's key in archive archaeology, is where you start to link what's happening in the past, the excavations in the past, with the excavations in the present. It lets us think again about the period, not only of what's happening inside this building, but what's happening in the drain, how all of the pieces fit together. So we're not going to stop in the early 4th century just because that's sort of a nice time in the Roman Empire, right? We're going to continue into the late Roman Empire and into the late 4th century Principia. This architecture, this framework, was the second phase that was identified in the early 1930s, in the 1930s excavations, and that was called Theodosian is now dated to the late 4th century. And we see that the Principia was adapted again with the changing administrative and social pressures of the late Roman army, and with the changing spatial pressures, the reality of life on site at Vindolanda. There was an increasing need for more controllable and usable space at Vindolanda. The verandas, what were permeable spaces that you could pass through on the street, are enclosed, and along with the courtyard rooms, they're converted into ventilated storage that's raised up off of the ground so airflow can pass underneath. Northumberland is rather damp. Things have a tendency to grow mold, especially if that's your foodstuffs. That's really no good. And what we're seeing is that these changes that are happening in the Principia are reflecting the pressures and the changes that are happening across the site. At this point in time, there's a reduction in ventilated storage in the granaries immediately to the west. And so we're seeing that the Principia building itself is absorbing some of that storage space need. And so the late 4th century Principia does have an architectural change. It has new constructions, new walls, and that very much is reflective of the larger construction of the site. And we can see these late 4th century improvements when we look in the archives. And these late 4th century improvements, not only are they changes in storage space, but they're also reflecting the changes in residential space needs that are happening at Vindolanda. On the other side of the Principia, we have the Praetorium, which was the commander's residence. It was space for the commander, for the elite, for their family. But at this point in time, things are not going quite so well in the Praetorium. We have some reconstructions happening on the north side. We have some collapses of the walls on the south side. And there really isn't anywhere to live. And so we see that the Principia itself, on its south side, is converted from being administrative space to being something that might be quite nice to live in. It has a raised floor, it has a hypocaust, it has a furnace, you can heat it. That makes it a livable space that in fact mirrors the architecture that was present in the Praetorium, but is no longer usable. Also, the addition of a latrine and of a well. These are things that make the Principia not just administrative, but also a comfortable residential space. And this is part of the changing spatial and social fabric of the site more broadly, that the building adapts in response. It's not something that's fixed. These are structures that grow and change as the people require different things of them. And so we have some improvements in the late 4th century, and all is well and good until we get to the early 5th century and the end of Roman Britain. Except that it wasn't the end. Careful archaeological work has shown us that life didn't come to a screeching halt at the end of the Roman Empire and the withdrawal of the Roman troops in 410, or so they say. And even on the Roman frontier forts, this is not the end of times. The recent fieldwork at Vindolanda and the excellent recent post-Roman publication has shown us good evidence for the sub- and post-Roman periods, so 4 more centuries of occupation. But rather than looking at occupation by a Roman army, we instead have a structure of local elites. The Principia was not included in these recent excavations, right? Eric Burley had helpfully uncovered the entire thing, and it was the center of the site and on display. But the catch with that is that the post-Roman period wasn't really of interest to Eric Burley and Ian Richmond when they excavated it. So they moved quite quickly through that, looking for more interesting, more Roman details. But the archive is what lets us look again at this and to expand on that excavation record that's very, very minimal and very light, and expand their minimal interpretations in the published material and come back to the excavation record to look beyond the publication. And so if we see in this plan of the post-Roman Principia from the later report, or from the current post-Roman report, really, we can see what areas were still in use. The northern end of the building has enclosed rooms, it has the well, it has the courtyard, and the south end, which was just changing in the late Roman period, again continues to be reconfigured. Access to the smaller rooms is blocked, reopened, and blocked again. And that's something that you can see really well in this photograph on the right? You've got a floor that's raised up, you've got a large stone that's a cross piece that could have been a threshold, and you've got more stones that are blocking what might have been a doorway. Drawings give us the impression that a building is in a fixed space, but they really weren't. They were growing and changing. And work on this period especially is ongoing. I'm finding more material every day that I'm in the archives, especially photographs. And that just goes to show that there is so much more work to do, and research is never finished, even if you want a project to come to an end. So what we can say at this point in time, until I'm done with all of the analysis on all of the new material that's turned up this winter, is that the Principia continued to be inhabited and adapted, and likely is the home of the person in charge of post-Roman Vindolanda. As we look at the Principia and its long-term development and its role at the site over the site's history, we can see that it was, in fact, the microcosm of the larger social and spatial changes that were happening. As the community composition and its identity shifted from the 3rd through the 4th and into the 5th and the 6th century, the building itself adapts to different roles to interact with the people and the landscape, to interact with the people inside, but also to adjust to the pressures and the changing spaces outside. And so the Principia building really is key to study. It is at the center of everything. But what it also does is it highlights just how much we can do with legacy data. The Principia was something that had been established in the site plan and in the site's narrative, but looking again at it closely with a thorough and careful evaluation of the original publications, but also of the archive itself, it's possible to see not only new phases in the structure, but how these connect with and influence the site more broadly. And it's so important that we do this by linking modern excavations with archival data. Archival data can answer some phasing questions when we're looking at structures themselves, but it can also contextualize new work. As we think about where Vindolanda's excavations are going, we can start to contextualize the new excavation program, the next scheduled monument consent in the northwest corner of the fort, with all of with the excavations, the past excavations that the new work is touching. And so the Principia really is more than just a phase or a series of phases. It's about connecting all of the pieces of material that cover the site's history. But lest we think that it's just about the Principia, or that it's just about a project that can happen sort of at a time, because this material has been sitting. Instead, we really need to think of archival research as something that is urgent, as something that needs to come out of the box. Right, it's been sitting in a box. We could continue to wait. Maybe somebody who's interested will get to it. Maybe not. It'll be fine. But that's really not the case. We talk so much about how important it is that we continue excavations at Vindolanda because climate change is affecting the anaerobic conditions in the material under the soil. So too are the archival materials really quite sensitive to climate. They're sensitive to heat, they're sensitive to light, they're sensitive to fluctuating temperatures. And there are some things like photographs and negatives that just age, as do we all, I suppose. But it's something that we need to look at now. It's something that needs to be stabilized, conserved, and protected. And it's something that gives us so much more for the excavations. When we dig into it, it lets us connect the excavations that have happened here to the excavations that will be happening in the future. And it's something that needs to happen before any more time has passed, because unless we can connect the work that's happened in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s, the institutional record with the institutional record and the institutional memory with the physical record, we're going to start to lose material. And it is this, if we don't have this, we won't be able to put back together the pieces. It was luck that we found sketches and drawings that identified which rooms were labeled, which rooms were given which letter label to identify where the coins came from. It could easily have been something that we never found and that we didn't know, and then it remained a question mark. And so the big challenge now is to take this archival material and connect it to the archaeological material that we already have and that we hold, the finds in the museum, the object database. And then once we have that, we can connect it back to the site itself, and we'll have the pieces, we'll have the physical space, we'll have the objects, and we'll have the paper record that will give us an unparalleled depth of information and research opportunities. What we can do with the archival material is dig, and learn so much more. And the goal is for us to make this information accessible, to make it web-based, to make it open to the public. And before you all go jumping in your search browsers and saying, where can I see this? I must say we're looking at least a decade of work. This is going to be keeping us busy for quite some time to pull the material out, to organize it, to put it into stable containers, to scan it, to get it online. But this is something that is really exciting to see how the Vindolanda Trust can continue to research both on-site and off-site. And as we look at the centenary celebrations for Chesterholm in 2029, looking back all the way to 1929, we're really making a start at looking at Vindolanda's history. So stay tuned for more on the website, more on the blogs, more on the newsletter, of different ways to get involved with the archives and with the archive archaeology. So for those of you who want to dig inside as well as outside, the archives are certainly one way to do that. Thank you very much.